Thank you all so much for joining us today. Welcome to today's conversation on navigating productive conversations without confrontation, in collaboration with our partners from the National Institute for Civil Discourse and Senior Planet from AARP. Today, there's a lot of polarizing things going on. We just came off of election day. So over the course of the next weeks, months even, you're probably going to have some really tough conversations with people, especially around holidays. We have Thanksgiving coming up, and then right after that, Christmas. So we hope that in today's session, you guys can take away some tips, tools, and resources to have more productive conversations. I'll be starting off today, but later in the presentation, we'll be joined by Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. She'll be sharing with us some amazing insights that she's learned from her work in civil conversations. So with that, allow me to introduce myself. My name is DeMario Phipps-Smith. I am a journalist and a marketing communications professional. I started my career at the Chicago Sun-Times as a digital editor. From there, I was able to freelance at a number of organizations, including Blavity.com. So I started my career in more of a traditional newsroom, but then later as the media industry and media landscape evolved, I found myself working in more digital and agile startups, eventually landing in communications at a non-for-profit on the west side of Chicago, where I'm from. And in my role as a storyteller, I really came to understand and be witness to the amount of disconnect that marginalized communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, have when it comes to news media. And so it became a big passion of mine to do work that helps build that bridge back between communities and news players. And that kind of brought me to my work at the News Literacy Project, right? I am a journalist in nature. I'm big on news literacy. And I always wanted to find a way to, what's that missing link between journalism and regular people, right? Like with the digital age upon us now, I don't think that people necessarily look at news with the same value that they once had. So that became a really important thing for me and led me to my work at the News Literacy Project. And so throughout today's session, you'll be seeing a number of tips, resources, and tools. Plenty of these can be found on newslit.org. I would advise you all to please check it out. It's very cool. My colleagues have been working very hard at restructuring our website. And if you're plugged in with the education community, please share this with any educators that you might know, any teachers or students that might be really interested in promoting this work and becoming more news literate. So a little bit about the News Literacy Project. We're a nonpartisan national education program, a national nonpartisan education not-for-profit. And our goal is to have news literacy be embedded in American education from people of all backgrounds to all ages so that they can understand credible news, which will help empower them to become engaged in civic life in their communities and ultimately their country. So news literacy is clearly a very, very vital part of our democracy, right? The information and credible information sources and people being able to discern that is the basis for us to have civil discourse, right? For us to have agency and autonomy in our actions as an engaged citizen. And then another good point is that democracy actually requires us to have really healthy discourse, right? Not that we always agree with each other, but that we can have civil disputes and have conversations around things that are very important to us as a country. And so it's vital that we be able to understand what is misinformation and what are credible sources of information. So we'll jump right into it. What is misinformation? Misinformation is typically false, inaccurate, misleading, and incorrect in nature but it's regardless of the intent to deceive, right? It doesn't matter if they're trying to do it or not, it's still misinformation. The problem with misinformation is that sometimes there's really not a very distinguishable line between what's fact and what's fiction, right? The issue with a lot of convincing misinformation is that they hinge on this nugget of truth, right? This element of truth. It could be something as small as the day something happened, right? Or as large as somebody playing in it, but it may not necessarily be the whole truth. And people really gravitate towards that one nugget and kind of make a snowball effect out of it. Gratefully and thankfully, we have now a number of professional fact-checking organizations that are working to address this spread of misinformation, and we'll be sharing some of those resources in the chat. So we see that among misinformation is this term called fake news, something that's really become highly politicized and a very charged term, right? It doesn't describe something that's fake and inaccurate. It's actually it's actually used as a defense mechanism for someone who doesn't want to believe, the information that you're trying to purport to them, right? They look at it and say, oh, that's fake news, so it can't be true. But really, it's just something that disagrees with their ideology. And so it is important that we distinguish these terms and come up with more accurate categorization of what misinformation is and what it is not. So misinformation, as we discussed briefly, is anything false or misleading that is created regardless of its intent to deceive. But if we hone into this term disinformation, it's also false and misleading information, but it hinges on the intentionality behind it. In most cases, it's really hard to know if something was posted in a deceptive manner, right? It's hard to really trace that back. But if you think of disinformation as a subcategory of misinformation, focusing on the intent can help you understand the motivations behind it, right? So, for instance, a clickbait farm that's just making headlines about, these outrageous propaganda-filled headlines is really trying to get you to click on the article because in the article they have ads. So there's a financial incentive there. Sometimes people want to sow political division, right? Or there are other people who want to gain political influence or public influence. So let's get at the heart of this. Why do people really believe in misinformation? Well, misinformation really plays on our biases, right? It wants us to just feel that something is true without really doing the critical thinking aspect to figure out if it's true. It hinges on this emotional and cognitive manipulation, right? Really trying to get you to share and amplify things that just feel true. And oftentimes we see that people gravitate towards information at times of great civil unrest or political upheaval. People clamor to information to calm their fears and anxieties about things like the pandemic or wars. And sometimes that information that they find isn't necessarily true. And then another thing, a really big part of people believing in misinformation is this connection to a bigger cause, right? That I'm a part of a community of people that believe, and if we believe, it must be true, right? So the emotional manipulation is key, and I want you guys to really think about this, right? So when it comes to how our emotions can be manipulated, I mean, it runs the gamut. Everything that we experience emotionally can be manipulated. We often see that this manipulation is driven by fear and anger, right, towards something. But it's also sadness. And in many cases, it's also curiosity. When you think about things like a phishing scam, right? If you got an email phishing scam telling you, hey, you just won this prize, click this link to know more. And once you click the link, it's like someplace that's trying to steal all your information. So it is very critical that we're aware of the ways our emotions can be manipulated. So the role of misinformation, the role of emotion and misinformation is that it really wants us to focus and center on our emotions, right? And not use our rational thinking processes. And by doing that, we react simply just by sharing something and amplifying it. Like, yeah, this is right. This is true. This is, yeah, see, this is, confirming what I already believe. And so but also in this, we see that studies have shown that older adults are especially vulnerable to misinformation. And that's in part because of the tools and access to tools and resources, and the training that comes along with that isn't necessarily always presented or available in the best ways. But then also there's just the fact that as we get older, our belief systems become more rigid, right? It's harder for us to change the way that we think, and that's just a natural process. So misinformation wants you to react emotionally, right? It wants you to jump on something that feels true. Like, yeah, just share this because it feels true. It confirms everything that you've been thinking bad about the pandemic, or everything bad that you've been thinking about the country, or everything bad that you've been thinking about the government. But it can work the opposite side too. It can confirm, try to confirm the good things that you believe in things. So it's really tricky. But what we want to move people from is this emotional response to rational reasoning, which is the process of evaluating information, the facts behind it, the assumptions, and the other resources to determine if something is a credible, logical argument. Now, during the height of the pandemic, we saw a wave of misinformation. An inundation of a lot of things telling people to be wary of vaccinations. And so this particular image really draws upon a parent's connection and heartstrings to their child, right? No parent wants to see their child harmed by anything. And I would imagine most of us can remember the times when we were afraid of shots, right? Like going to the doctor and getting a shot was like the worst thing ever. And even as an adult, if you don't feel as bad about, getting a jab, it still kind of, could be a traumatic experience for you, and thinking about what that might be for your child. So misinformers took that emotional connection that parents have with their children and use it to manipulate people emotionally so they can share this. Yeah, the vaccination is bad. All they're going to do is jab your child in the arm, when really the correct way to respond to this is to go look it up, is to go figure out more information about it. If you're that concerned about the vaccination, go look it up, go find more research, go talk to people. But the first thing you shouldn't do when you see something like this is just share it, just blindly share it. Don't do that. That's the one thing you shouldn't do. And so outside of the emotional responses or the emotional connections that they try to draw or manipulate you through, there's the biases that we have, right? So this example is a tweet shared by Patty Murray, claiming that Republicans were trying to end Social Security and Medicaid, right? She decried it, but the Washington Post did a fact check of this and found that that actually the evidence disputes this. There were only statements made, just things said by a couple of Republicans that would lead you to this conclusion, but there was nothing grounded in facts. There was no litigation. There was no policy made to make sure this happened. So it was just a broad stroke that she was trying to connect something with to make us believe something is real. And so this is an example of confirmation bias, right? When we see this, we're like, oh man, this must be true. Like this is coming from a credible source in a sense, right? It's coming from a politician. But then also like, it just sounds real, right? They're somebody that you're plugged in with, that you might be in their community, you might believe in their politics. So when they say something, it naturally might feel like it's true, right? It's a passive thing. It's nothing to feel guilty about. We all have biases and we all have some inclination towards confirmation biases, but it is important to be aware that you might have these biases. For this example, we see This example is talking about the January 6th pipe bomb incident. And in this tweet or in this Instagram post, they're trying to connect Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene with the pipe bombing incident. So if you look at the two side-by-side images, they're both videos, but I don't have them to play for this, but they're both videos basically showing, trying to connect the way that Representative Greene carries herself, the way she walks, her mannerisms. They're trying to connect that with the pipe bomb perpetrator. And whereas these are both raw footage from like real things, they're not connected in any way. They want you to make a connection. They're trying to reach a connection, but it's clearly not there. And it hasn't been substantiated by anything to make it true, which makes this an example of motivated reasoning, which is an active and deliberate attempt to search for information that confirms what you already believe while disproving things that counter it. And at this time, I believe it would be a great section to break for questions. I see that there's a lot of stuff going on in the chat. I'll try to get to some of these, and if you have some, please drop them in the chat. And also, I forgot to mention my colleagues, Alexa Volland and Tori Saya will be joining us in the chat to help out with any questions and comments, and they'll also be dropping resources, as well as my colleague, Ali Quick as well, I'm sorry. We have a lovely team, and I'm so thankful for them to be helping support us today, and they're doing a great job. Love the graphic. Thank you. Yeah, there's some great conversations being had in the chat right now. I love it. Definitely encourage it. And if we don't have any questions at this time, I think we're good to move on. So why is it hard to talk to someone who believes misinformation? Well, the case is that they believe as much as you do that what they're coming to the conversation with is true, right? It's not that they are playing about this. It's not that they're taking it lightly. They seriously, in many cases, they seriously believe that what they believe is true. This misinformation is true. In more extreme cases, they see themselves at war, right? They see themselves as being them and their community against the world. Oftentimes, people's traumatic experiences with institutions can cloud how they trust sources. So that plays into it as well. So if you had a bad dealing with an institution like education or law enforcement, it might lead you to think that, a conspiracy theory or misinformation is true. This strong connection that people have to their beliefs also helps influence their identity. So it's not something easily, people aren't easily swayed by what you have to tell them in a lot of cases, but you want to have these conversations because it is important, right? And the relationships that you're building with people are important. So you want to have productive conversations, but it can be hard because having this conversation is tough. People really do intrinsically believe in this misinformation. So here, and we'll touch more on this later in the presentation, but when it comes to conversations, we like to ground ourselves in a thing we call PEP. Patience, empathy, and persistence. You need the patience to understand that it's going to take some time, right? This isn't necessarily something that you can convince somebody of in a day, maybe not within a couple of weeks. Sometimes it might take months. And in some of our more challenging relationships, it might take years to get this person to finally see this. And then the next thing is empathy, right? Like respect the person that you're talking to, right? Respect their experiences and what they've learned, right? It's an exchange of information. It's not a battle. You're not arguing for the sake of winning. You're trying to help stop the spread of misinformation. And it is an important thing, but it's also important to respect other people and their beliefs. And then the last thing, be persistent, right? don't give up on the person after one conversation, right? Sometimes it's really hard, right? Learning new information, especially as we get to later stages in our lives, becomes harder to accept. So sometimes just having the patience with somebody to learn when and when not, to learn when to pick up the conversation and when to let it go is a really important element of all this. So in some of your conversations with some of your loved ones or people that you know who might be influenced by misinformation, you might, they might present to you a piece of misinformation and you say, wow, I can't believe that you actually believe this, right? I can't believe that you actually think this would be true. But then on the other side, they're going to say, I can't believe you don't. And so this is a point where conversations devolve, right? And you want to avoid this, I can't believe this, you can't believe that thing, this battlefield of ideas and exchanges. You want to have a more productive conversation. But one of the things that you need to ask yourself is, how important is it to me to correct this person? Like, how important is this relationship, right? And how important is this issue in this relationship, right? Sometimes you're right. If you think that continuing on with a really challenging conversation with someone who isn't accepting of new information, your intuition is right. You probably shouldn't continue to have that conversation with them. But if it is important for you to really to build a safe place for you all to have a conversation about an issue, and it does mean a lot for you to exchange your ideas regarding this and to help them understand what they believe is misinformation, then it's going to take some time. And I hope you are empathetic about it and that you practice some patience as well. So before I wrap up, I want to give you all a little exercise to help you talk to somebody who might believe in misinformation. So take, for instance, someone shares with you a tweet that claims the government has filed a patent for a product called luciferase, which is a bioluminescent material that is being used to identify who is being vaccinated, excuse me. And so before you even engage, there are a few things that you would want to do in preparation for this conversation to really understand what's going on. So here you would want to understand, what exactly is luciferase? And is it actually in vaccines? The next thing, if you take a glance at the tweet to the left, is, what is NTD News exactly? Like, it looks like a news organization, but I'm not familiar with NTD News, or I wasn't when I first saw this, and that should be a red flag. The last thing that you want to be aware of is, what sources can you find that would back up this claim and act as evidence? So the next step in the conversation, after somebody is giving you this piece of misinformation, your response might be, I've never heard of NTD News, so I had to look them up. They don't seem very credible, and they are very, very partisan. If you look at the chart to the right, brought to you by Media Bias, which is a great website that I love using to get more of a breakdown and analysis of news organizations, they break down the reporting efforts of NTD television, and they found that it at very best had very mixed reporting, right? They often promoted conspiracies, propaganda, and false claims, and it didn't rate very high on credibility scores. But instead of attacking somebody with this and attacking their source and saying, oh, I can't believe you would believe this place, a pretty productive thing would be to say, okay, I see your source, but I was able to find and they don't look credible, but I was able to find a news source that I believe is credible, and it conflicts this. Do you mind checking out my source? Do you mind looking at my source? Do you mind if I share it with you? And so upon your research, you might find an article like this from Reuters, which actually happens to be a fact check. And it founded that the conspiracy theories about the Homeland Security and luciferase were unfounded and untrue. And so you could do this too if it comes to somebody who might have a heavy distrust in media. One of the ways to kind of appease that might be to do a media check on them as well. Like most of us are familiar with Reuters and understand that it is a legacy organization that's been around for hundreds of years, that have like hundreds of news bureaus in countries all over the world. But for some people, that's not enough. So if you're going to be critical of one source, it's also good to be critical, show that you can be critical of even the information or that you've been sound-minded in how you approach them with the information that you have. And so obviously the Reuters article determined that the conspiracy theory about Luciferase was untrue. And then you can take it even a step further, right? Like not just the source. Well, news organizations, their sources are, medical experts, right? When it comes to things like vaccinations and medical enzymes, medical experts are the people that news organizations quote and attribute their information to in news articles. So you can go straight to one of those sources. You can go straight to a health organization, right? So the next step in the conversation might be, hey, I actually found something interesting and continue my research about this. Did you know Lucifer is actually the Latin word for light bearer? Like this whole thing connecting Lucifer with luciferase actually really isn't a thing here. And according to WebMD, luciferase actually refers to a chemical process that allows organisms like fireflies to glow. And then if they still don't believe you after you've given them numerous sources, and like I try to remind people, one source is great, but we always aim for the rule of three. And if you can give people three things at a time, it makes it harder for them to discredit it. But if you've gotten to the place where you went through your sources and you went through primary sources, if they still don't believe you, you might want to take it to the original documentation. If you recall, the earlier tweet about luciferase actually mentioned the patent, that the government patent this chemical. And if you go back to the patent, it's available online and you can look it up. If we go back to the patent, you'll actually see that the government wasn't using it to track who had been vaccinated. The proof is in the pudding. If you read the abstract, it quite clearly tells you what it's about. But the key is if this, and if after all these things that you have done to try to disprove a source of misinformation and that something is inaccurate, and you've been empathetic and you've had patience with this person for however long, it might have been just for the length of the conversation, or it might have been some weeks or some months. But if it just seems and feels like you're not getting anywhere, or the person isn't really open to the information you're sharing with them, just disengage, right? Just remove yourself from that. All you're going to do is waste your energy, and they're going to waste theirs, and it's just going to be a big waste of time. There's nothing really that can be productive out of that. So when you're at home and you're looking for tools to help you to debunk things and to fact check what somebody might believe is misinformation, don't worry about it. The News Literacy Project has you covered. We earlier this month, we debuted our new fact-checking tool called RumorGuard. It is an amazing platform. We're really excited about the notoriety that is building. A lot of people are interacting with it. And to give you an example of how it works is, well, if you in the screen, in this example, we're fact-checking a video of a delivery van in Detroit carrying voter ballots that people online were saying was a case of voter fraud. But the post was actually hinged around the timing of it. They kept saying that, oh, you can't do this, it's illegal because it's after 8 o'clock. But actually, the voting deadline was being misinterpreted. It's totally fine and totally normal to have delivery vans delivering voter ballots well after that time. It's nothing new. It's only one of those pieces of information we're not really sure, that the typical American isn't really sure about. So when it's posted somewhere, it kind of sounds true. And if you already believe in voter fraud or have some type of inclination towards it, it's only going to drive that home further for you. But instead of sharing this and amplifying it, we encourage you to check it through the 5 factors of authenticity, right? We have these on our website. They walk you on the RumorGuard website. They walk you through the process that we take in order to debunk this misinformation. The first step is the authenticity of it. How authentic is this, right? Is it, from a credible source? Has it been doctored or edited in any way? And is it, something that you can trust? The next thing is the source. Has it been posted by somebody credible, right? Is this a retweet of something else from a different party? You got to be really careful. There are sometimes misinformation posted to make it look like it's from an official source, but it's really from an external source that has nothing to do with the official source that they're citing. The third step is the evidence that behind it. What has been presented that proves that this is true and real? The next thing is the context that is being presented in. Is this the accurate context? Did this happen when they say it happened, where they say it happened? And is the circumstances in which this presented actually true and valid and truthful in the moment? And then the last step is the reasoning, right? Is this based on a logical argument? Is this something where, there was a conclusion made and that there were assumptions and that there were, the makings of a logical argument there? And so if you want to learn more about RumorGuard and you want to join the movement to stop the spread of misinformation in the country, please subscribe to RumorGuard. We definitely want you to try out the platform and learn more. You can join at rumorguard.org/join. And at this time, before we get into the last session of the presentation, I'd love it to open up for any questions or comments that anybody has at the moment. Oh, cool. I see a lot of great questions. So the first one from Doug T. What is the historical trend on misinformation? Has it always been as prevalent as it is now? Yes, it has always been as prevalent as it is now, but in different ways. I think what makes it so prevalent now is the proliferation of social media, right? We see so much, it's so easy to be connected to the rest of the world now, right? And when the printing press was first invented, you were sharing misinformation with the people in that small community that you were in, or amongst a very dedicated community. But now it's so easy to create misinformation on such a mass scale that it does seem like it's more prevalent than ever. I guess maybe the reach is as big as it's ever been, but it's always been a part of societies, human civilizations. Let's see. Karen asks, would you say that some people are lazy-brained, i.e. they just don't want to put in the work to verify and clarify, so they hang on to exciting storylines? I don't know if I would call it lazy-brained, but I kind of see where you're going with that. I think what it is that we have this natural inclination to take it's much harder to think critically about something, right? It's much harder to do research and to have a discussion with somebody and to have your thoughts challenged. It's much harder to do that. And so oftentimes, I think we've all been a victim of this. We've all kind of just kind of passively accepted something that was true because it was just easier at the time. But I wouldn't necessarily call it lazy brain, but I get what you're saying. Claire asks, how do you handle a relative who has a huge amount of research on his belt and can talk about any topic before I can even start to research it? How do I counter his excellence? And I mean excellent research, rarely miss or disinformation. That's a good question. I think that So if it's rarely misinformation or disinformation, this is just a battle of beliefs, right? Like, I think what we're trying to do is help people have those productive conversations around misinformation, right? When it comes to bigger philosophical things or politics or stuff like that, you can only present your side and they're going to present theirs. And, it's a personal relationship. But I would say when it comes to battling misinformation, the key is like, have your research present, be very clear, have some empathy, and practice patience. But I think what you're talking about is more about like personal belief systems, which are harder to to get somebody to see the other side. And if you do, share with me that book that you write on it. Let's see, Alicia, I'm sorry if I'm messing up your name. Murray says, if people do not have access to information, they do not have the skills of resources. What are the best ways to handle misinformation and then calculation? Simply asking, why do you believe that? And where do we go from there? That is a great question. I think that our country is still trying to figure that out, right? How do we get people who may not have access to, digital or not digital, to what might not have access to the web or might not have access to a computer or credible information in their neighborhoods? How do we help inform them? And I think we're still working through that. We're still figuring out ways, and it looks different in different circumstances. But I think the key is really to ground yourself in people's experiences, right? Ask people who feel like they aren't being supported in information gathering and those processes of being news credible. I think it's important to talk to them as well. And really understand what their issues are, where they're coming from, where they feel like the deficits are. I think that's a really important element of it. But I hope that answers your question or helps. Claire also says, do we sit with our phones to rebut their words? No, you don't have to, but if that's what you do in order to not have challenging, hard conversations with people, you got to do what you got to do. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to get to one more question before I get to our last section. Karen Jacobson asks, what do you say to someone who admits it's all misinformation, perhaps even racist, misogynistic, or anti-Semitic, but but do you want me to have no friends? Yeah, that gives back to the personal element of this. Like, I get it. We're going to have challenging conversations in our lives with people on things that they believe or we believe, or trying to challenge those things. And if they admit it and they understand that it's just misinformation, this is just a person that wants to be misinformed, right? When we talk about the ease of just accepting something versus actually doing the work to think critically and accepting someone challenging your belief, those type of people, it's just easier for them to believe it. They don't want to hear anything else. And this person, unfortunately, might just be a lost cause. Okay. Thank you all so much for the great questions. We had an awesome conversation going on in the chat. I appreciate you all so much. So at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer. She is the first ever executive director of the National Institute for Civil Discussion. Dr. Lukensmeyer has built a reputation as a leader in the field of deliberative democracy, working to restore public trust in our government. Prior to joining the NICD, she served as the founder and president of America Speaks, a non-for-profit organization that promoted nonpartisan initiatives to engage citizens through development of innovative public policy strategies. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Lukensmeyer, and we are thrilled to have you join us.
DeMario, thanks very much. It was a pleasure to hear you speak about really good tips about how to deal with misinformation and disinformation. And I wonder if we could just go back to the screen with people on it for a minute rather than PowerPoints. We've been looking at PowerPoints for a long time. And it strikes me that it'd be nice to see a few people's faces for a minute or two. National Institute for Civil Discourse is really delighted to join with the News Literacy Project and Senior Planet to deal with these important questions about how can we actually talk with people who think so differently than we do. Mario has really focused mainly on the disinformation, misinformation. And in my part of the presentation, I'm going to just go into straight polarization issues. You know, you want the wall built along the southern border. I don't want the wall built. And it may have nothing to do with dis or misinformation. It's just we have really different views on what should happen in our country. So let me first just say I'm going to do 4 things with you. Where are we now? What does this mean for our relationships? Give you some tips as we head into the holidays. And then look a bit beyond the holidays in terms of, given where our country and culture has come to this sense of enemies rather than civil opponents, we need to think beyond the holidays about how we engage differences where you have your own sphere of influence, your place of work, your place of worship, places beyond your family and intimate friends. So let me go to just a couple of pieces of data about where we are now. Obviously, the midterms did demonstrate that the vast majority of Americans want to go to a more regular politics. I'm not saying that because Democrats won more seats than were expected. I'm saying that because of things people said when they came out of the exit polls. But still, prior to the midterms, the last poll data we had, 86% of voters say that our democracy faces very serious threats. And frankly, this is equally split between Democrats, Republicans, and independents. Nearly 50% believe that increased access to trusted news and information is one of the most important ways to improve democracy. That's why work like the News Literacy Project is so important. That's why all the new outlets that are popping up around the country to be trusted, Chalkbeat about education, the Marshall Project about criminal justice issues. We have to get back to a place that democracy only works if people are actually informed. So let me just take a minute. Why are Americans so angry at each other when in fact there's actually agreement on more things than there is disagreement on? An important point. Americans think the difference between who's a Democrat and a Republican and what we believe is nearly twice as large as it really is. So much of the issue that we're dealing with in such difficult conversations is a perception gap rather than a reality gap. That's why it's important when people get together in small groups, even one-on-one, is to set the basis for their connection with each other and identifying things they agree on before we go to the heart of the matter about why you think income tax should be raised and I don't. It's also true that since the 90s, we've gone through a dramatic social sorting in the country. People began to move to neighborhoods where there was a match in income, a match in race, a match in general interest and kinds of social activities, so that it is now true that other identities, like am I living in an urban area or rural? What's my religion? What's my race? Those identities have become more highly correlated with party than used to be true, which makes our politics very tribal. One of the things that this all means, this brief data I've given you, is that there's serious consequences. Consequences for our democracy and its capability to problem solve, and consequences for us as individuals. with many thousands of people reporting broken relationships. For political leaders, this partisan paralysis, putting party before the country to win narrow majorities, means we aren't solving pressing problems. We haven't solved climate change. We haven't solved immigration. You know the list. For political leaders inside our institutions, means they've stopped responding to the other party as civil opponents, but they react to them like bitter enemies. But now let's look at citizens for a minute. We have to deal with two categories of Americans at this point. We have Americans that are on the political extreme, probably about 12, maybe even up to 15% on a way radical right, 9 to 10% on a way radical left. Those Americans, as citizens, actually see the other end as an evil enemy that is immoral. But the good news, remember I said 12 to 15 and 9 to 10? That's only 25% of us. Now, not that that isn't serious, but that means that 75% of everyday Americans are actually hungry for more functional politics. That's what led to the outcome that we just saw in the midterms. Okay, if you give me the next slide, please. I want to focus on what this means for our relationships. As you're thinking about moving into the holidays, and you think about the people that'll be around that table, really do a little inventory and ask yourself, is this relationship important to me? If the answer is yes, then there's a few principles I'd like to ask you to remember. Listening is very, very powerful. People don't often talk about this, but one of the highest needs a human being has is to be heard, so that I know my voice, I know what I feel has actually been heard by another human being. Excuse me, I'm going to have to grab a drink here. So you need to back up to realize that the act of listening to someone else's statement, however much you may disagree with it, it's actually very powerful in affirming to them that you respect them and have heard them. Now, this in no way means that you agree. It doesn't obligate you to agree. It just means you've affirmed the importance of that person's experience. And hopefully they will do the same for you. Now, very often when we're dealing with differences on issues, our energy is focused on convincing the other person to come to our point of view. So again, in this context where you want to reestablish the importance of the relationship, maybe even say it as big as it is, to heal a divide that's developed between the two of you, you want to focus more on learning and sharing and skip the debating or trying to convince this person of your point of view. You want to learn, why do they think this? What in their life experience has led them to this particular perspective? If you do this authentically, my guess is you'll hear some things that actually surprise you. Here's a little finding from social science research that will also maybe help you give up trying to convince people in an initial conversation over a holiday table. People very rarely change their beliefs in a conversation live as it is happening. What does happen in that conversation is expanding understanding and increasing curiosity to learn more about the other's point of view. So something that happens between you and Uncle John at Thanksgiving, who you know you disagree with going in, but he also is your favorite uncle, maybe you will say something to each other that increases his curiosity in learning more about why you believe what you believe. We don't know the steps that follow a conversation where people feel authentically heard and understood. Okay, just a few principles in general. if your goal is to strengthen relationships, and that's what we're talking about right now, I want to go back and underline what the News Literacy Project now has as a mantra: PEP, patience, empathy, and persistence. A couple other thoughts. Focus on generous listening. I said enough about that before. You're in a context at a holiday dinner that I think it's pretty safe to assume good intent. Now that may not be true 100% around the table. And then if you know that someone comes in with an intent to rile things up, with an intent to create conflict, then I think the goal is to move the conversation away from allowing that person to be able to do that. Enter these conversations with genuine curiosity. What would you really like to understand about this person's point of view, or why they hold that point of view? Your goal is that each of you walk away from the conversation feeling respected. Now, the last word we put up here is humility. And what I'm about to say may surprise you, but I hope you'll take it very seriously. Those of us who do believe that we're operating on facts, that do believe we are caring about, from a moral perspective, the common good, sometimes forget that when we're going into these conversations with people of serious difference, we have to enter that conversation with enough humility that it may be me that needs to learn something. It may be me that needs to shift something about my perspective. This one I often find is a tough nugget for some people to swallow. But if you think about it, in one of those conversations over the Thanksgiving table, my guess is you'll be surprised at how it increases the openness of the other person to engage with you. Let's go to that holiday meal. We often at NICD, and I want to tell you, that first Thanksgiving after the 2016 election, we were stunned. We got thousands of messages, email, social media, and frankly, people picking up the phone and calling an organization that they'd never had a contact with, saying, I'll never forget one conversation, a mother in New England, nearly crying. We have 2 daughters. They're wonderful, beautiful young women. They're both in Ivy League schools, different ones in New England. One voted for Trump, one voted for Hillary. They haven't spoken since the election. And we don't know how to approach Thanksgiving dinner. So what we came up with, that lots of families told us later really worked. Now, for some families, it's a religious matter, and you start the meal with a prayer. But in the absence of that, you may want to start the meal with a toast that your family creates. An example: we're grateful for this time, this food, this place, and those who have prepared the space as we welcome and love being together. May we extend this sense of gracious hospitality throughout our time together. Now, we at NICD are not attached to those words, but you get the spirit of what I'm speaking about. Something we also recommended that we heard very good feedback was, today is Thanksgiving. For many Americans, it's truly their favorite holiday, certainly true for me. And we actually recommended that you start before the meal, going around the table, each person. We did this, we've been doing this for years around our table, and our age range currently is 2 to 77. We basically said, we want to start right now, just quickly going around the table with each one of us saying, right now, in this moment, what am I most grateful for? And what's lovely is most people say something that surprises their mother or their sister or their cousin. So you might want to try it. Okay, a few practical tips as the conversation proceeds. Ask thoughtful questions that will lead to understanding. Avoid interacting to convince or persuade. Another very effective tool or tip is invite people to share personal stories. What was the moment this year that you were most proud to be an American? Or the flip side, what was the moments that this year scared you the most about the future of America? And again, those sound like big questions, but I think you'll be surprised. People love to share personal stories and personal moments. A few other practical tips. You know, I said this earlier, it's factual. When you put Americans in a room, even people who are 10 points on the scale of hating or loving Trump or hating or loving Hillary, if you create the circumstances for them to share first things that they really care about, what you discover is that by vast majority of Americans, even some in those extreme ends, actually agree on more than they disagree on. So it's always important to acknowledge those areas of agreement. Equally important, sometimes we've seen people start with these kinds of practical tips and they're amazed at how well the conversation is going. And then they start to slip into trying to convince, trying to shift the perspective. And suddenly the sense of well-being or the sense of comedy in the conversation begins to dissipate. So recognize when it's time to end the conversation. You've made some progress today in that you really shared moments and information and stories that you didn't know before that have brought you closer together. Don't let that head on a downhill direction. And when you've finished, thank each other for the conversation. We don't often do that. I'm going to jump back up now, not to just our dinner tables at holidays, but I've kind of already said this, but think back around our country and we as citizens of America. There's some things that have always been true of us. We have always had disagreements. Our founders didn't make it through the first Constitutional Convention and had to try again. So there's nothing in our history or in our founding documents that would suggest that we should not disagree with full-throated feelings. The point is to do it in a way that's respectful and can move us to finding some compromise to build common ground. You know, the United States of America was the first country in the world that was founded on an idea, not a shared religious belief, not a shared victory in war, but an idea that human beings are capable of self-government. And even almost 260 years later, we have never actualized that belief. We've been working toward it. We've made a lot of progress, but we haven't ever fully reached that idea. So again, in our experience at NICD, and over the, I guess it's almost 9 years now, we know that upwards of 50,000 Americans with very different beliefs on these issues have talked to each other in civil ways that led to deeper understanding. And what we always found, no matter how radical they started out, everyone shares a commitment to perfecting the promise of America. In just a few minutes, I want to flip from our intimate circles, our families and close friends, to your role in the larger world. Every single human being sits in several spheres of influence: at work, at your place of worship, in your community, or it might be a viral group that you share on the internet. You all love jazz from the 1920s and 30s, but it is a group that takes your voice seriously. Now is a time when rebuilding trust in our country, trust between individuals, trust in communities, trust in our institutions, and ultimately trust in our own democracy. It is vital. And frankly, trust is something that only exists in people. And it begins with each one of us. Every time I enter a conversation, I am open to trusting, or I am closed and not going to go there. So in your larger spheres of influence, given how trust has really deteriorated in our country at all levels, institutions to individuals, we hope out of this experience that you'll take another look. You'll do a little inventory of your spheres of influence. What relations do I have in those spheres that are important for me to maintain, to repair, to build? And how do I want to be connected to even other networks of people that I'm not yet a part of? Where again, as I enter them, trust will be a factor in how I behave and how I hope I am reciprocated. What opportunities do I have to engage differences productively? Well, again, obviously we have this opportunity every single day, tens of times in different contexts. But given the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to come back to the holiday again. Obviously, Thanksgiving is next week, but shortly behind that will in fact be Kwanzaa, will be Christmas, will be Hanukkah. Every major religion, Ramadan, of course, will do it a little later after the new year, but there will be these gatherings again where there's an opportunity to think deeply about what trust means and how not just to build it with your own family and intimate relations, but how to use those occasions to influence other people to think about how they conduct themselves in their spheres of influence. We were so delighted to join with the News Literacy Project and Senior Planet because all of us at NICD do believe that the way in which the country has moved away from shared fact-based information makes our democracy, really is a peril to our democracy. So another assessment, wherever you live, is there trusted local media in your area, your town, your neighborhood? And trusted local media operates at many levels. Neighbor to neighbor is a huge, important way that people are sharing civic information that matters in order to live and problem solve together. But do you have a print, a radio, a local broadcast, social media networks that are very active in your area that are trusted? There are literally hundreds of people working to create new outlets in local communities that can provide trusted, not only news, but civic information. If you're listening to this webinar, you know that you're in an area that has no trusted local information media outlet. Cheryl, I'll ask you to put my email address into the chat. And please reach out because I would be happy to connect you to people who somewhere near your geographic area are working on this problem of recreating local trusted media. It is essential for our democracy to thrive and revive that this is true in communities all across the country. And how can I elevate trusted information with my sphere of influence? Well, I think DeMario gave you many examples. Number one is don't ever share misinformation or disinformation, but be a voice in a way that people trust you to help people orient back to who's that local news anchor that really everybody does trust, and remind them to be sure to watch the 6 o'clock news when Stephanie is on the air. Or broadcast television. What's the channel in your area that actually is fact-based and that people could go back to listening to rather than listening to those cable channels that by definition are at one end of the ideological spectrum or the other. You have been wonderful to listen for so long to DeMario and myself. I want to open it up again. I think there may be time for a few questions, and I'm happy to respond if I can. We already have put up the screen share. Of course, we want your feedback. There's a survey monkey that we will look at and take very seriously.
Yeah, so now, oh, sorry, go ahead, Carolyn, sorry.
I don't know if there are any questions in the chat that were particularly focused to me in terms of the polarization issues around the holidays, but if there are and we have time, I'd be happy to respond to a few.
Cool, I'll try to pull some out for you, Carolyn. Oh, I like this one from Ted Robbins. Curious, how can I respectfully ask someone to stop trying to convince me?
Hey, that's a great question. This may surprise you, but it's a thing, and again, you'll have to experiment a little bit in how it works for you and who the person is. But I sometimes just say, hey, Tim, I feel like you're just trying to convince me of your point of view. I'd like to spend a little time in which we better understand why each of us believe what we believe. And then we can come back to see if we want to try to convince each other. But don't let's start there.
Awesome. Let's see. I'm looking at the Q&A. Maybe there's some good questions too in the chat. And if you guys see some from NLP, if you guys see any that's worth calling out, please tag them for me. Well, Alicia asked, would you have any resources on or comments on why social sorting started to happen in the 1990s?
There's a fantastic book titled The Big Sort. I'm not at the moment pulling the author's name out. Maybe one of the rest of you can quickly search it and put it in. His name is Bill something, I'm sure. He does a fabulous job of describing why that began to happen. You won't be surprised to hear that one of the issues was around schools and wanting to ensure that children were in schools that met the parents' desire for quality. Now, underneath that conversation, when we're talking about quality of education, the issues about racism always come up and certainly are worth investigating.
Awesome. I see a lot of questions about, is this being recorded? Yes, you can access this webinar. It will be available to you all after the session has ended today. I believe there will be an email going out tomorrow, I believe. Sue Ann asks, where can I find more presentations like this? Part of my job at the News Literacy Project is giving in-person trainings and webinars on things like this, having tough conversations, conspiratorial thinking, misinformation, the list goes on. So if you would like to get connected, get your organization connected with a training like this, you can reach out to us at the News Literacy Project, or you can reach out to me at my email address, which I'm dropping in the chat right now.
I saw one question that I think is really important that could as much go to DeMario as myself, but it was a question about approaching your school district or board of education about incorporating news literacy into schools. Something that I've found very effective about that is having a chat with a teacher in the school that is responsible for, some schools even have classes in journalism, but if you can identify a teacher in the school that would also like to see this be part of the curriculum, approaching the principal, school board, higher authorities, so to speak, with a teacher is always a good idea.
Absolutely. And just to add on to that, as far as it goes with the NLP's involvement, definitely check out our webpage. When you're having these conversations with educators, it's good to give them examples and show them maybe the curriculum. We have we have this platform called Checkology, which is made for educators. But yeah, I would definitely suggest checking out our website and contacting us so that we can help support you in that effort to help educators help their students become more news literate.
I see a note from Mary Robb who says she's been teaching news literacy for 21 years. DeMario, it'd be great for you and your team to get in touch with Mary and maybe share the curriculum that she's using up on the website.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mary, if you would email me after this presentation and give me a little bit more information about what you want to do, or just introduce yourself and we can take it from there, I would love that. And awesome work, and keep it up.
I see another comment from LJ Latimer about, I myself in undergraduate was an English and political science major. I know exactly what you mean, that interpreting literature, those principles do apply to news media. It's a great idea about a collaboration between English and civics.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. I don't want to eat up too much of your time, and I do want to be cognizant of it. We went a little bit over time today, and I appreciate everybody for being so engaged and sticking through this whole thing, listening to us speak. But I appreciate you so much for taking the time to join us today. If you haven't had a chance to fill out the survey, it's really quick. Please fill that out for us. It'll help us make these presentations even better in the future. So on behalf of our partners at NICD and Senior Planet from AARP, thank you so much for the time today. And I wish you all nothing but the best of luck in your future productive conversations around the family tables.
And let me join DeMario saying thank you so much to the News Literacy Project for inviting NICD to be part of this project.